Hi everyone, my name is Anne McElhenney.
And I'm Phelim McAleer.
And welcome to the Anne and Phelim Scoop.
Yes.
It's July.
That's the scoop, not the Daily Virus.
No, but we should mention the Daily Virus.
Yes.
Which everyone that is listening to the Daily Virus is enjoying it.
What is the Daily Virus, Anne?
It's a daily podcast telling you about the news, views and advice to survive the pandemic.
And madness of the pandemic. So yeah, it's available on all podcast platforms, and we do this program every morning. Sometimes I think we cover everything, and then you read the news that day, and you see you have covered what they're talking about and what other people are talking about. So it's a curation service, but we do original reporting as well. So it's available on all podcasts.
And by the way, when we started doing it, we thought it would last 6 weeks. So 18 weeks later. Yeah, and yes. Unfortunately, I don't see any end in sight.
So if we can get up at 5 a.m. to do it, you can
get up whenever you like.
And press the play button.
Okay, so later in the podcast today, in the Scoop podcast, we're going to be talking to Lindsey Burke from the Heritage Foundation about the situation for children with...
The crisis they're facing, really.
Yeah.
So Lindsey's the Heritage Foundation's expert on education. You won't want to miss that. And as we are... Later on, also, as we are the Unreported Story Society, we're going to bring you some truths about civil rights icon John Lewis, who died last weekend. And it's facts you won't see anywhere else, and facts you need to know about John Lewis.
And on a cheerful note, we have a foolproof fish recipe that you really won't want to miss. And it's also kind of like, it's a bit of a showstopper. It's a showstopper that you can bring to the table and impress your friends with. And we love...
Very impressive. I had a hand in it.
Phelim had a hand in it. And we just love how much you love our podcast. And we're going to bring some of those comments that you've sent and some of those lovely reviews you've sent to us at the end of the program. And by the way, anyone who wants to do that, please go on your podcast platform and leave us a 5-star rating and a review. We'd really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, we really would like more ratings, actually. We've got some wonderful reviews. In fact, the reviews are pacing the ratings. So it's easier to just leave a rating. Hopefully it's 5-star. Just press the stars and hopefully the stars will align.
And because Magda isn't with us and we're doing this we're using a different camera angle and stuff like that, I know you haven't seen the cats as much as normal, and some of you are missing the cats and have asked for proof of life. So at the end of the show, we're going to show a series of photographs of the cats, because I don't know if you're like us, but and I just put this up on Facebook. It was funny, the reaction from people, because I basically said something like, because of the pandemic, you've probably taken 10, 100,000 photographs of your cats, and eventually you'll take some good ones. So we've got some very nice photographs, and I put that up on Facebook, and people started sending me very impressive photographs of their cats, like that made my impressive photographs of our cats look less than fabulous. Like really great photographs of cats up in trees and stuff. Anyway, really nice. I should show those photographs, actually. I might add some of those photographs if I can.
And you can see these photographs on the YouTube channel. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can go to YouTube, the Anne and Phelim Scoop YouTube channel.
And you really want to go there for the Wednesday Scoop, because you get to see some visuals. Okay, tell us, Phelim, about the icon the civil rights icon who has just died.
Yeah, John Lewis, he died last weekend, and he promoted non-violence. Really led to great change. Some of it was coming anyway, but he was there right at the front when maybe it wasn't that popular. But he used that political capital in a way towards the end of his life that just has left a sour taste in my mouth. In 2008, John Lewis, the civil rights icon, he accused John McCain and Sarah Palin, who were running for president and vice president, accused them of being racist. He said they were sowing the seeds of hatred and division, and went on to suggest that the Republican ticket, they were creating a climate for racist terrorism. And he went on to link McCain and Palin's policies to the types of policies that led to the church bombings of the 60s that led to 4 children, that famous church bombing. A terrible, terrible thing to say. And, when you hear, this goes to a bigger picture. When you hear Trump being accused of racism, and that he's not like Reagan and he's not like McKay and those gentlemen and all those gentlemen. When McCain was running for president, he was being accused of rhetoric that would lead to church bombings, that would lead to kids' deaths. So now, that was John Lewis, and that's what he said. And you could say that's heated rhetoric by John Lewis. And I do believe in the Dennis Prager standard that people should be judged by what they did, not the worst thing they have said at a particular time. So let's look at what he did, and I think this is particularly unacceptable. I remember this well because I remember discussing it with Andrew Breitbart at the time, and so during the Obamacare vote, when tensions were really high and there were protesters outside,
I remember this,
outside the Congress, he and several other members of the Congressional Black Caucus left their offices and marched past the protesters. Now they had a tunnel. There's a tunnel from their offices to the voting place where they can avoid the public, but they chose to walk in the public. Other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and came in and claimed that protesters had shouted the N-word at them.
It was a big story. I remember that, 2010. And they got an enormous amount of coverage. Everyone was reporting it, that these people from the Black Caucus the N-word had been used against them.
And they were spat at as well.
And they were spat at and all of that.
Yes.
But Andrew Breitbart was brilliant.
Thought, this sounds just, by the way, this is 2010. There were cameras everywhere. There were hundreds of cameras.
Everyone had a mobile phone.
Yes, but there was TV cameras all over the place. Mm-hmm. So Andrew Breitbart offered to donate $10,000 to the United Negro College Fund for any video evidence of anyone saying the N-word there.
$10,000. And then what did he do, Philip?
Then he raised the award to $100,000.
So, God, $10,000, by the way, a nice one if you can, and how easy, by the way, and what a lovely way to give money to education for minorities and all that. Great idea, by the way. And then he got it raised to $100,000.
That's a big chunk of change. And that's a scholarship for...
And $100,000, not one piece of evidence could be found to back up what Lewis had said. So that's something to remember about John Lewis.
He falsely claimed good, well-meaning people who were his political opponents had used the N-word against him. To me,
it's really
pretty
terrible.
bad now.
And it's unforgivable. And it's also that thing, that really despicable trick people have they do that thing where they say, have you stopped beating your wife? And then the headline is, man denies beating his wife. So it's basically, these Tea Party activists were accused of being racists. And it's like, Tea Party denies being racist. And it's just, once it's said, it's really hard to walk it back. But Andrew Breitbart did a great job, by the way, of setting the record straight on that occasion. Unfortunately, we don't have Andrew with us anymore. More people should do exactly what Andrew did and call them out and say, I'll give you $100,000 to give to your favourite causes, and guess what happens? There was no evidence. Yeah. But we're going to go to our guest right now, to Lindsey Burke from the Heritage Foundation,
yes,
and it's a perfect time to have her on.
Yes, it's really one of the most important topics of our time. Children's education, always important, but with the pandemic, mass closure of schools, it's never been more important. We've received so many emails about this subject. So that's why we wanted Lindsey from the Heritage Foundation to come on. We recorded this interview earlier, so let's go to that interview now. You won't want to miss this, and you won't want to hear just how America is faring and how it's faring state by state and how it's faring internationally as well. So let's go over to Lindsey.
So we're now joined by Lindsey Burke, who has a PhD and is the director of the Centre for Educational Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where she oversees the foundation's research and policy on preschool, K through 12 and higher education reform. She holds a bachelor's degree in politics, a master's of teaching degree and a PhD in educational policy.
And welcome, Lindsey. No one better to talk about this issue. We're getting a lot of people writing to us about the schools issue. It's at the centre of this pandemic politics, and we really want to hear the bird's eye view of it. So
welcome, Lindsey. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. And, you're exactly right. I was joking with somebody the other day that when this hit back in March, it didn't immediately dawn on me what a tremendous impact this would have on education policy broadly. And we're at a point now where it is upending every possible aspect of education, from preschool all the way through higher education policy. And so it has just been, from a policy perspective, an incredibly interesting time. I know from a parent perspective, it's been a concerning time. But whatever happens over the next few months, I do think we're going to start to have more and more information about exactly what schools are going to do in response. whatever happens, it's certainly going to be interesting to watch how schools across the country respond.
So when we look back, though, Lindsey, at what has already happened,
Yeah.
we're finding out information now that I think is still not getting enough attention, where there's this staggering number of children who have not had access to any education. We know here in California, it's over 30% of children who have not accessed one class. What are you hearing nationally about children's access to education over the last months?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's been, I think, spotty is probably the most generous way to say what it's been like over the past few months. And you're right. The California experience is not necessarily unique. If we look across the country, about 1/3 of districts have done a decent job providing some access to education to students. Another third are providing online content, but aren't taking attendance. They're not assessing students, really tracking their progress. So I'm in Washington, D.C. That's one example of a district that's operating that way. And then you've got a third of districts that really, for all intents and purposes, are not providing any education to speak of to students. And so, 2 years from now, I think we're going to have a lot of data that unfortunately suggests there was some real learning loss over this time period. And I'll just say, California, where you are, in particular, the Los Angeles Teachers Union right now trying to use this pandemic as a bargaining chip to really fulfill this liberal wish list that they have released over the past few weeks is probably one of the most concerning things that we've seen yet. And there's been a lot of issues to be concerned about.
Tell us more about that. We've read that wish list, but many of our listeners and viewers won't have. Tell us about this bizarre document that they released in all seriousness during this pandemic.
Well, it is about as far away from an education document as you would expect it could possibly be from a teachers union. So the Los Angeles Teachers Union, which has the Los Angeles Unified School District as part of its group of students and teachers that it purports to represent. By the way, the Los Angeles Unified School District is the second largest school district in the country. So we're talking about over 600,000 kids impacted by schools not reopening. So the teachers union in LA has said, well, we're not going to bless school reopening until we see things like the elimination of charter schools, raising taxes, Medicare for all, defunding the police. So like I said, things that for the most part are about as far away from education policy as you could possibly get. And it's just been incredibly clear that what they are after is just trying to fulfill this long held, pretty radical agenda that they've put forward.
I think you made the very interesting suggestion recently where you said, instead of defunding the police, we need to defund the teachers unions.
That's right. And the way to do that, it's sort of a, kind of interesting way to put a spin on the argument that they're making. But the way that you actually do that, if you were serious about defunding the teachers union, is you provide families with choice. You give them an exit pass, an escape hatch out of these government-run, government-assigned district schools that are not only failing to meet the needs of kids, but are now not even open in large part. So give parents the option to take those dollars that would have been spent on their child in that district school and to take them somewhere else to a school of choice that's actually open, that meets the needs of their children. That's how you ultimately defund the teachers union.
How bad is it nationally with this online learning? Tell me, did all states close all their schools? And the ones that did close, is California an outlier with the 30%? Or, give us a wider picture.
Yeah, so it's not an outlier in terms of the 30% number, the 1/3 of districts that aren't fully reopening. If you look across the country, when the pandemic hit in March, we had immediately about 50 million, and if you include private school students too, about 55 million kids who are K-12 age who were all of a sudden out of their particular school, had those school doors closed, whether it was public or private. Of course, the vast majority are public. About 90% of students attend public schools across the country today. And so that was the bulk of that 55 million number. And so there were a couple of states that didn't completely shut down, or at least allowed school districts to determine whether or not they would close down fully. And we've started to see a few states and a few districts move in the direction of reopening fully in person. And, I think the other thing that's interesting that the US should at least, families in the US should at least be aware of is that around the world, countries are reopening schools. We had a report out recently in the Daily Signal that outlined far more than 20 countries, largely in Europe, have decided to reopen. In some instances, countries in Europe never closed down at all. So you can look at in Europe places like Sweden never closed schools when the pandemic hit. You can look nearby to Denmark. Denmark was the first country in Europe to reopen schools. They reopened schools all the way back in April. And Denmark, it's interesting because they have done what is just now starting to catch on here in the US, which is they've divided students into small groups that they're calling pods of around 12 students to keep those students sort of co-quarantined, if you will. But across Europe, we're seeing schools reopen, and hopefully we'll see schools in the US follow suit in large part.
You point out that this pod idea that they had in Denmark, were there other innovative ideas that they've had in other schools across the world that could be adopted here to allow students to get back to school?
And granted, this will be difficult in, say, Phoenix in the middle of the summer. But what we are seeing around the world is a lot of schools are moving classes outside to the extent that they're able to, that they're actually having schools just teach outside. And so that's something, and kids love that, of course, but something that could also just be good health policy as we think about reopening schools. And so, yes, there are some logistical challenges when we're talking about a city like Phoenix, or, if winter rolls around and you're in Manhattan, certainly. But for the most part, that's one of the more interesting approaches that we've seen so far.
Why should we care about this? I mean, I know lots of our listeners and viewers who have children in schools know this is very important, but is school essential? Is there any fallout if a child's education is disrupted?
Well, this is something that, again, I think 2 years from now, when we get all of the data in on this school year, we'll really be able to answer your question with some empirical data as to the exact impact that these school closures have had. What I think is really interesting to think through is the rapidity with which the market has responded and parents and families have responded to this moment in which we find ourselves. I think everyone would acknowledge education is incredibly important. It's important for your upward economic mobility. It's important for fulfilling your future life goals and aspirations that your child has. So the question really is this a moment in time where we can break away from how we've traditionally conceived the delivery of K-12 education? Can we finally, at scale, separate the financing of education from the delivery of services, right? What Milton Friedman suggested we do all the way back in 1955. And this is where I say the market is responding in a really interesting way. We said the P word a second ago, pods. We're starting to see families in the US group their kids within a neighborhood or within a social group that they might have, group their students, their children, in pods of 6, maybe 12 kids, co-quarantine them, and then families pay in monthly, and they're hiring private tutors, and to some extent even hiring teachers who would have been in a traditional school. This is really, really innovative. It's something that is catching on like wildfire. And I mean, over the past week has caught on here in large part. And so we're going to see this. I tweeted last night that this is going to be pod week for education. I really think we're going to hear this week in particular a whole lot about this idea of pandemic pods or education pods for students. And just as quickly as that popped up, questions about equity for students popped up and access. And this is why it is more important now than ever that we start to fund children and not systems, and allow those dollars to follow them to whatever it might be, including education pods.
So these are private individuals deciding, groups of mothers and fathers deciding to pod their children. And you're saying the state should, rather than view them as a rival, fund them to the same extent they fund public schools.
That's exactly right. And I think, this has been one of the goals of folks who have worked to reform education. And, I'd say even more than just conservative public policy folks, but people who are really interested in improving educational outcomes. That has been the perennial goal for a long time, is moving toward a system where we fund children and not systems, and allow those dollars to follow kids to any option of choice. And as we see this, what I think is a really fascinating proliferation of pandemic pods or education pods proliferating, where you have families who are able to pay out of pocket privately to hire maybe their prior public school teacher or hire a private teacher or a private tutor. They're able to pay out of pocket, group together with other families in their neighborhood. I think this is a really beautiful response to the situation in which we all find ourselves. But we need to also make sure that families who might not have those resources are able to do so as well if they want. And so the way that we do that is we give them access to the money that would have been spent on their child in that public school. A lot of these schools are shut down right now. Their doors are closed. So fund the kid, don't fund the brick and mortar school, and allow those families, particularly low income families, to be able to have that same educational opportunity that we're seeing middle and upper income families really craft for themselves right now. I love education savings accounts, ESAs. I think that is the best way forward that we have so far to provide access to those funds, because they're flexible and nimble, more so than a traditional voucher program, which I also love, but ESAs are even more flexible than that. And so I think that's the policy response now in the states. States need to be providing emergency ESAs to families to enable them to do this. If they want to do a pod, to hire a private tutor, to go to a private school that might be open, to do some online courses, whatever it is that works for them.
Is that beginning to happen already? Are there states that are doing that you could point to?
Literally just this morning, it was about 5 minutes before I came on the air with you, we saw the governor of South Carolina, Governor McMaster, announce that they are going to provide scholarships to students in the state there since schools are closed, making sure that they have educational consistency. We saw earlier this year, Florida, Governor DeSantis in Florida expanded their ESA program for students in the state to make sure they can have that educational continuity. Pennsylvania starting to talk about it. Oklahoma did so about 2 weeks ago now as well. So we're starting to see it move in a direction of, I think, policymakers and just public policy broadly recognizing that we need to fund the kid, that public education means providing the public financing, but allowing that delivery to happen in any type of space. And that if we don't do this now, if we don't provide funding directly to families, we could lose years in terms of learning time, particularly for those low-income students.
And also, I think, and you haven't mentioned it, and I don't know if it's your area of expertise, but I mean, one of the things that we've been concerned about in this in our podcast is the mental health implications of children being feral in some ways. Being completely without any access to the normal educational structures that they're used to, and what exactly the results of that are going to be for people. Is that something that you're probably even anecdotally aware of at this point?
Yeah, anecdotally for sure. You're right. It's not my area of expertise, child mental health, but we have heard this anecdotally. And, again, I think this is why if families are starting to craft their own sort of co-op or cottage classes, micro schooling, it comes in all different names and flavors, that we need to make sure that kids, that they aren't just at home sort of cordoned off to themselves as a result of the pandemic, which, by the way, I would say we need to think about very differently than families who have chosen to homeschool pre-pandemic. It's a whole different thing when we're talking about a kid at home who is having to learn on a Zoom chat that the district is supposed to be providing to them and not doing a very good job. So for those kids, you're absolutely right. And we need to make sure that they do have access to their friends, their teachers, to whatever education option was working well for them before. And it all comes back to making those dollars more flexible and more nimble.
Just a quick political point on that. Are you finding on this particular issue, perhaps there could be a moment of hope here? Are the Democrats and the Republicans kind of joining forces a little on this? Is there any kind of bipartisanship in terms of this, of putting children first?
Yeah. So I think to some extent, right, I think there is agreement broadly around this notion that something needs to happen, that education is critically important, that families need to be in the driver's seat. And I would say that goes for wherever one might fall on the question of school reopening, that it should be families determining in conjunction with local school leaders what works best for that community. And so I do think that there is agreement there to some extent that it shouldn't necessarily be a national conversation that's happening, right? We can't have the federal government come in and say schools across the country need to close or open or whatever it might be, that it's got to be driven from the ground up. So I think there is some consensus there. I do think, last thing I'll say, what is interesting though, is I think that the teachers union, in an ironic way, is starting to enable this free market response to the pandemic, because they're effectively keeping schools closed and families are moving toward market-based options like pods and micro schools.
Have you any idea the kind of statistics we're going to have in a couple of years' time, in a decade's time, that will show this to have been a disaster for children? Is there any kind of statistical figures emerging at this minute?
Not at the moment, because there is always such a lag in the testing. So we have one major test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It comes out every 2 years. So an even more frequent test, things like the SAT, the ACT, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, some of these assessments, even those assessments have been put on hold during the pandemic. And so this is just, I think, to some extent, going to be a bit of a data desert for the next year and a half or so. So what we know is families are responding. We know that family is becoming the sort of educator of the moment, right? Of course, family is always a child's first and foremost educator, but that has really been catapulted to the forefront right now. And so what we're going to see is the impact of really having families broadly lead that education during this pandemic. And so we've really just sort of upped the megaphone on the family aspect there.
So how did you get involved in education? What's your background?
So I had, quite honestly, waffled between studying politics and French as an undergrad student, and then went the politics route. And then when I went to pursue my master's degree, sort of waffled back onto the French education side. And so ended up doing a master's of teaching, and had done some long-term sub work and taught some high school French. And then I moved to Washington and took a position at the Heritage Foundation, which was an education policy position that I took about 12 years ago now. And it really just fulfilled all of those passions in one. So it's been a great experience.
So during the pandemic then, have you been cooking? We always ask our guests 2 questions at the end. One about a recipe and then also about a piece of art. Are you a cook? You're on your own there in that apartment, or what's happening?
Cook might be a bit of a strong word, but I try every now and then. Have been cooking, trying to eat less during the pandemic. But it's really hard when you're confined all day long. But I would say the one thing that I have always loved to cook that is easy and you cannot mess up are mashed potatoes that have a lot of fat in them. They are delicious. It requires not boiling your potatoes in water, which have to be Yukon Gold potatoes. You have to boil them in chicken stock, so no water. And then you have to have at least 2 packs of cream cheese and at least 3 sticks of butter. And they are delicious. Not healthy in the least. It's more butter than potato.
God, I like the sound of that. And then we also ask people about a piece of art, like it could be a movie, a poem, anything that has inspired them in their lives.
Well, I mentioned a second ago that I studied French as both an undergrad student and then when I was working on my master's, and have always loved Charles Baudelaire. He's just one of the best and was preeminent French poets of his time around the 1850s. He wrote a series of poems, 4 actually, called Melancholy, that are just really beautiful. I would highly recommend them. They're translated in English and French, and I think are actually well suited to the pandemic time that we're in. And one just really quick note on that, Charles Baudelaire actually translated a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's work into French and helped popularize Poe in France and throughout Europe. So just an interesting little tidbit.
Okay, well, we'll look up the melancholy poems by Baudelaire and put them up on our website for sure.
I think they may be pandemic appropriate.
Very much so.
Perhaps too appropriate.
Thank you so much for your time today. And I think we're going to talk to you again because I think there's other questions that we want to talk about. The general situation of education in the United States, how well we're doing in comparison with other countries, etc. But I want to come back to that another time.
And I think there's going to be a lot more, as you say, data coming out. And the unions are not going to go quietly into this, and this is a war at the moment. Actually, I want to ask. I mean, the White House doesn't have much to do with this. They don't have much of a say in this, do they?
They don't, and I'm thankful we don't have a national school board, and there's not a robust federal role to be played in education. Constitutionally, the feds have no role to play in education. I will say that Secretary DeVos has really hit the right chord lately, because she has said, if schools are closed down, then the small amount, relatively speaking, of federal funding that does exist should follow the child to schools that are open. So that's been a good development over the past month.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, well,
right,
we'll keep following.
We'll
this
keep
stuff.
following. Yeah, we'll be talking to you again, Lindsey. Thank you so much for your time.
Bye.
That's great.
Thank you for having me.
That was great.
Great of a little depressing, perhaps.
By the way, just the last thing that she said there about the mashed potatoes and the Baudelaire poem. The Baudelaire poem, by the way, we're going to put it up in the notes. I'm going to put it in the notes on the YouTube channel, and I think it'll also go up on the Facebook page.
What's the name of the Facebook page, Anne?
The Facebook page is the Anne and Phelim Scoop.
What's the name of the YouTube channel, Anne?
Is the Anne and Phelim Scoop.
Wow.
Isn't it?
Original?
I think
Yes,
it is.
yes, it is.
And but I wanted to just mention.
What's the
by
name
way,
of the podcast?
And the podcast is the Anne and Phelim Scoop. And I was going to just mention, by the way, that those potatoes, I definitely think I want to do that. She said very full of very full fat content. She didn't even mention accompanying with anything else, but I actually think that a bowl of those mashed potatoes could really get you past a sad day. I really liked her idea, by the way, of this pod learning and the idea of parents. If teachers aren't willing to go back to school, the idea that parents can be empowered and also funded to create these pods of learning. I think what a great idea. Yeah. But we need to have Lindsey back on, because I particularly I think the next time we have Lindsey on, I'd like to know more about the state, even before the pandemic, the state of public education in the United States. And I think there's a lot of people out there who'd be interested in that. But before the next thing we wanted to talk about before we come to the end, and we're very close to the end of the show, but one of the things we wanted to talk to about was about people's love of the show and the love of the podcast. We now want to just look at some of the stuff that you guys have been writing about us and giving us really nice 5-star ratings. And we don't do enough of it. And by the way, this first one, I really love this. And this is a registered nurse who's not believing the hype. And she says, I love your podcast. And I'm not sure, and by the way, she makes a brilliant point that is really worth mentioning. And I think we should mention this also on the Daily Virus. I'm not sure how I stumbled onto your show, she says, but now I never miss an episode. I find you both delightful. Thank you. And informative. I just have a random thought now that the demand of wearing face masks seems to be ramping up. What I've always said is, if this wearing of face masks truly is saving people from getting the disease, you would think standardized masks would be required, along with public education on how to wear and use them. Really, really good point from this registered nurse. If they're so important, why aren't we getting daily briefings on how you use them? There's no PSAs about it at all. I'm a nurse, this lady is saying here. I'm a nurse. I have I have had an elderly male patient, I love this, come in with lipstick and face makeup on his mask and stated that he had forgotten his mask, so he was using his wife's. I've seen people in public lift their masks to sneeze. Isn't because of spreading large droplets the reason for the mask? I've many stories, but my main thought is why no one randomly is testing the public's masks to see what's growing and what's growing and what the masks are spreading. And I love that. And by the way, I just said this to you yesterday, Phelim, but I have to say, the hygiene with the masks that we have, like I have them at the bottom of the handbag, and every now and again you'll go somewhere and we'll say to each other, God, do you have a mask? And we'll be looking at the bottom of the floor of the car and all kinds of
and we swap masks and I'll grab a mask.
100%. So it's very interesting, if this was as serious as we're being told, why no one is telling you how to use masks. I thought that was great. Next person here.
Is there a review on the Apple Podcast app?
Where you can go.
Please go there now, leave a rating for the show, hopefully a 5-star, and leave a review.
Thank you. And you can also, by the way, leave us a message, by the way, on the YouTube channel too. And this is from Texas Saint. Just a terrific show, well worth your time. This is one of the most insightful, interesting shows you can find in the podcast universe. Thank you. Anne and Phelim never fail to put the day's events in common sense context in ways that typical media either don't, can't, or won't do. Their analysis of COVID is unparalleled, in my humble opinion. I would not have the understanding that I have about COVID without them. Their guest interviews are top-notch as well. The two most recent ones, Eric Metaxas and Casey Diaz, were wonderful. I promise you won't regret subscribing to this podcast.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. And then the next one, Phelim, read this. My sanity saver.
Oh,
5 stars.
Thank you for your daily dose of sanity. I'm so tired of the constant negativity surrounding the virus. The mainstream media focuses only on the negative news. Also, thank you for suggesting the Lockdown Skeptic website. And they reminded us it's spelled with a K in the US, and that's lockdownskeptic.org. So it's a great website. Can't recommend enough.
Toby Young.
So this reviewer went on to say, I love your back and forth. You two are awesome.
Thank you.
See us when the camera's off.
Yeah.
How awesome that is.
I first heard of you when you were guests on a podcast discussing Gosnell. I then made sure to buy and read your book. Keep up the good work, and thank you for shouting out for the book. We're very proud of our first book. We need to write another one. Our first book, which was a New York Times bestseller and is a page turner, even if it's pretty bleak. The next one is Leslie Ann, 64, and I'm wondering if Leslie Ann was born in 64, as I was myself. My father, by the way, said to me, I don't know, many years, decades and decades ago, my father, by the way, rest in peace, decades and decades ago, he said, and I was like, I think like 31 or something, and he said, you know, you should never that you need to stop telling people what age you are now. Like he had this thing, like he had all these notions about things that girls should do so that they wouldn't be single all their lives. But don't tell anyone what age you are, you know. And it was like, and I wouldn't mind, but I was like literally like 30, you know. And he said, that's it. Don't tell anyone ever again. But anyway, Leslie Ann, I wonder if you're the same age as me. You guys are a breath of fresh air in the political podcast arena. I love how you outline at the beginning of the show what you're going to talk about. Phelim loves that because he thinks that's really important. And I've had arguments with him about that. But obviously, Leslie Ann, we're never going to stop now because you like it. And great information. I love that you're quirky and fun. Thank you. And I love your accents. I've learned more about current events and this not so deadly virus in the last few months listening to your show than any other podcast I listen to. I can't get enough. And I can't thank you enough. Sorry.
We can't thank you all enough for tuning in. Please.
And those of you who haven't left us a message yet or haven't left us a rating, we really would appreciate it. It makes a big difference.
But also, we'd like you, if you have an email list, send the link to the show.
Yeah, let people know. Let other people know about it because we really do want to get the show. As you say, it's very valuable. We do spend a lot of time and thought and energy into analysing what's going on with this virus and letting people know what's going on.
One thing I would say is, back in the old days, YouTube used to recommend videos to people. If you watched something, you would get recommended a similar video. And we got 50, 60, 70% of our views from recommendations from other videos. YouTube have now stopped that pretty much for political podcasts. So we're there, and if you're interested in what we're talking about, YouTube will not recommend it. So we have to rely on you, our viewers and our listeners to recommend us. So send that link to people so that they know.
Makes a big difference for
where
us.
We are.
So Phelim wants to tell the story about Sheila O'Flanagan, who is an Irish writer.
Yes.
Who writes. I think a sophisticated version of chick lit, I think, is the way to describe it.
And
definitely a sophisticated version.
Featuring older women, not the single 20s.
Which, by the way, is a much more, it's much more, the market is actually much more lucrative, actually, for that older woman. So she's smart. And by the way, Sheila O'Flanagan was involved in wasn't she involved in the world of high finance, so she knows a thing or two.
Yeah, so
what happened to her then?
She sold 9 million books.
9 million books. We did not sell 9 million copies of Gosnell.
But she's written 25 novels. And she's interviewed in the Irish Times, which is the New York Times of Ireland, and she makes some interesting and pertinent points about being a female writer and being a female popular writer. And as the author is forced to point out, they have not interviewed her. She sold 9 million books. She's one of the most successful writers in Ireland, in Irish history probably, and they haven't interviewed her since 1999. And in that same period, the newspaper had interviewed Colm Tóibín.
Who Phelim really doesn't like. Colm Tóibín, actually a great writer, by the way, but who has been interviewed by the Irish Times 6 times or whatever, 5 times.
Great writer, maybe, terrible human being.
He's the guy who wrote the book Brooklyn, which became the film Brooklyn.
But he's written lots of other books as well.
Yes.
And so he's been interviewed in that period by the Irish Times 5 times. And that's not counting the profiles and glowing mentions and dozens of other. I mean, if you put in his name in the Irish Times, just dozens, hundreds of mentions. And she makes the point. I mean, Brooklyn is a romance, right? She says if Colm Tóibín was Colleen Tobin and had written...
That's a girl's name, by the way, for you Americans.
It wouldn't have even been reviewed. It would be dismissed as a woman writing chick lit. So, you know, and she goes through what happened to her at various...
literary festivals.
When her second book was #1 the bestsellers chart, she was at a literary festival. The person hosting the event, herself a well-established female writer, said, I have to say, I've never heard of you. So what's your book called? Flanagan said her title was, gave the title of the book, Caroline's Sister, and said, actually, it's #1 on the charts. And the host said, yes, but we don't count that, right? So they don't count.
What a snob. What a snob.
So...
But you made the point yesterday. Why doesn't she name who this person is who said that?
See, I'm always a bit nervous of these stories that fit narratives really well.
By the way, sorry, I 100,000% believe it. And I think the reason she doesn't name that person is because they're friends, inverted commas, or she's somebody that hopes will talk about her nicely at another time, or invite her to another literary festival.
So then she goes on to talk about Normal People, the new book by Sally Rooney, which is now is it a HBO series or a Showtime series? Normal People, Obama loved it.
Apparently.
Everyone loved it.
We have not read it.
We have not read it. But Sally Rooney is a self-described Marxist. An Irish Marxist.
She's allowed.
Right?
She's allowed to be a Marxist.
She's allowed to be a Marxist,
She's
right?
allowed to be a Marxist.
But actually,
by the way, she could be a Marxist and write very well, so we don't know.
But that is a good point. And but Sheila O'Flanagan, who is now 62, said, you know, yes, Rooney is great, you know, but, quote, I think it's young writing, very beautifully written, but not a lot of experience. I'm sure she'll be a super writer when she's a bit older. Yeah. But you're right with the experience you have. See, which by the way, there's a certain element of truth to that, right?
Yeah.
But
it's bitchy.
But it's bitchy, right?
Very bitchy. But
the implication of that is that your opinions will mature and become, you know, better and more
like Sheila O'Flanagan,
layered and contexted.
Oh, so that you'd realise that Marxism is a really awful idea.
Yes.
And is that what happened to Sheila O'Flanagan?
And Sheila O'Flanagan, she was a trader.
She was a trader.
And she didn't start working until her 30s. Like, she'd made a lot of money. She wrote a column on...
Hang on, she didn't... What did you say there? She didn't start working until she was in her 30s?
Writing.
She didn't start writing.
Yes. She wrote a column in the Irish Times newspaper about economics, right? So... The interviewer says, given her economic background, I'm interested to hear her thoughts on the pan-session, the recession.
Pan-session, yeah.
And the country's eventual recovery. She is curious.
Pan-descension.
She's curious, for one thing, about what will happen to the office buildings, etc. And with outstanding Happy Clappy, will they be used for community hubs or cultural spaces where people can interact in a different way? Okay. You know, it sounds a bit collectivist there. In fact, you would almost say Marxist. It'll be difficult for years, absolutely, and growth will be hard, she says. Looking back to her central bank days in 1980s recessionary times and the more recent crash. She talks about the obvious necessity of long-term loans for the country, but she's also interested in whether different economic models will emerge. Quote, one not weighted so much in favour of big corporations or big business.
Yawn.
I mean, she's basically Sally
what
Rooney.
What are you, 12?
Yeah, no,
evil corporations.
But then, you know, this is just to show you, this is an Irish writer writing female-oriented literature in Ireland. And who does she go straight to? Quote, if you look at Trump, he just wants to default back to where it was before. I hope we are more progressive in terms of changing the business model. I always thought, even back in my finance days, it's a choice you make. Do people work for the economy, or does the economy work for the people?
So here she is talking about her books, her fluffy books about romance or whatever, and she manages, no matter what, to get in a dig at Trump. It is, so, what are you, 12? And by the way, can I just say about Sheila O'Flanagan? Sheila O'Flanagan has that one thing that Phelim always wanted in his life, and kind of has sort of slightly achieved, not really, of Sheila O'Flanagan divides her time between her home in Ireland, in Dublin or whatever, right, and somewhere in Alicante, right?
Yes.
Alicante, by the way, a little bit of a cliche, that I have to say, Alicante in Spain, because I do believe, I don't have the map in front of me, but I do believe Alicante in Spain is the south coast of Spain, where every other expat who decides to live in Spain decides to live.
I know.
So were you not more interesting than that, Sheila O'Flanagan?
Well,
now, by the way,
actually, you know what?
9 million books later, by the way, I'd say she has a really nice house in Spain.
I'd say she has a lovely house. Don't be criticising some 29-year-old Marxist for not having lived a life and having had experience and being able to write about it, if you're basically a 62-year-old Marxist. or social, democratic
Is
socialist.
Sally Roney 29? She's 29.
She's not.
Well, she's not a child, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, you
I
know.
mean, funny, I actually thought she was
But
younger.
she probably wrote the book in her mid-20s, you know, or early to mid-20s. So anyway, look, Sheila O'Flanagan and all those people out there who are lamenting, you know, the world not paying attention to them or the world not taking them seriously, try having an original opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure...
And try and park your virtue signalling for 10 seconds when you're giving an interview.
Try to say something interesting.
Try to say something interesting, yeah. Your virtue signalling about Trump is a massive yawn to people who know better.
But it's also, it's the same as every other interview
That's
in
right,
the
Phil.
Irish Times.
I said that. It's like a massive yawn. It's like, oh my God, here we go again.
No, but you said it's a massive yawn to people who know better. I think it's even a massive yawn to people who don't know better. Even people who hate Trump do not want to read another person saying Trump is evil.
I think they do, actually. I think they really love that. It's like a panacea. But they just can't
But
get enough.
they're not going to buy your book. They're not going to...
Oh, no, they are.
They're not going to...
No, well, actually, funny enough, they are, because they're going to think she's one of us. And we've gone into that world where there's us and them, and there's people. Yeah, no, there's a lot of that. And I have to say, I just found that just
How do you what's your unique selling point?
What's her unique selling point? She's just like everybody else in Dublin 4, and people like that. They like the familiar.
Yeah,
people like the familiar. I'm ready to move on to the recipe film and leave Sheila O'Flanagan to her divided her time between Alicante in Spain and Dublin. Good luck to you, Sheila O'Flanagan. And try go for an original thought there, girlfriend.
Yeah.
9 million copies of the book, though. Loads of respect for that. So the recipe this week is, I just think this is so great. And by the way, stolen recipe. This is a stolen recipe.
Ooh.
Stolen and I suppose adapted, actually, from the Wall Street Journal. And we'll put it up again. We'll put it up in the notes. And the Wall Street Journal got this recipe from Michael Tusk, who is a chef and restaurateur. And I'm going to pronounce this really badly, but basically, this is halibut en papote. Okay, Papillote, which is the French way of cooking a fatty, particularly fatty fish, about a half-inch thick, halibut, brilliant, salmon, brilliant, in a package. And the package, you create the package using parchment paper, and you seal it. But what you do is you put the piece of fish on the parchment paper, and so I had 2 halibut fillets, really gorgeous, from Costco, of course. And it was wild caught.
Do you know Costco don't advertise?
They don't advertise.
Why would they?
Why would they when they have me? So they have two beautiful fresh fillets of halibut, fabulous, about a half-inch thick, about 12 ounces-ish in total, right? And then you put pepper and salt on that, good bit of pepper, dry it off first, pepper and salt on that. You need lemons. You need, and I was using, the recipe from Tusk actually asks for oregano, fresh oregano. I'm actually a really big fan of fresh parsley, and I also have fresh parsley. Mm-hmm. So we used fresh parsley. And then, I love this idea though, 2 cups of cherry tomatoes, a teaspoon of red wine vinegar, olive oil, cloves of garlic, and they called in their recipe for snow peas. I didn't have snow peas, I had frozen peas, so I threw the frozen peas in. But I think what would be really nice would be thin asparagus, and then a few tablespoons of white wine, and serving that with baby potatoes and salad. But what you do is you throw you put in the cherry tomatoes and the lemons and the wine, and I'm going to, as I said, all of the recipe will be printed in the notes of on YouTube. But you put all that stuff and you create this packet and you seal it. So there's the wine in there, there's the red wine vinegar, all of that stuff is in there. And you let that cook. And it doesn't need to cook for very long. So preheat the oven to 450 and put your packet in. And I would say it'll be done in about 15 minutes, possibly even less, depending on how fast your cooker is. Mm-hmm. And then what you want to do is you want to bring your package to the table and you sort of crack it open. You'll know it's done, by the way. The package itself will probably turn kind of brown at the top. But
although you take ours didn't, to be honest.
Ours didn't, but weren't they fabulous?
They were fabulous. I mean, ours were done well, you know.
You're seeing the photographs here, by the way. I'm putting up the photographs as we're speaking here. And one of the things that you do at the table to be kind of, you know, for your show-stopping event is that when you're opening the packet, you've created in the kitchen earlier as well, you've got with a mortar, and by the way, you don't need a mortar. You can use actually just a bowl. You combine parsley and garlic and finely grated zest of a lemon, and lemon juice, and and some olive oil, and you squinch that all together with some salt as well. Squinch that together, and then you create this nice paste out of that. So when you open your packet, you pour that paste in on top of each of the things. You'll see it. It's very clear from the photographs, by the way. If it's not clear from, but look at how beautiful. Can I just say, look at those photographs of how beautiful the table turned out. I had a really nice glass. Funny, you'll see in the photograph, I think, that I had a bottle of rosé there. The rosé was wrong. Let's just be honest. So actually the thing to have, and I did quickly substitute that out, but I don't think it's in the picture, is I had a Sauvignon Blanc. A Sauvignon Blanc, much more citrusy, much more acidic than the rosé was too much on the sweet side for me for that fish. But anyway, really, really nice, really gorgeous, and you can't go wrong. As I said, get a nice fatty piece of fish, and it's just great. Now, Philip, one of the things that's happening to people is people are taking a lot of photographs of their cats through the pandemic, and if you take 100,000 photographs, one of them is going to be nice. So we're beginning to look at photographs here. Philip, tell us, what's the latest news about the cats? We have some very big breaking news about the cats.
Well, I think we've told you, they're now indoor-outdoor cats. They get out in the morning. Oh, look at those lovely pictures.
Aren't they lovely pictures? Look at the lovely pictures.
They get out in the morning and they... Oh, look at that. That's a nice
Not
one.
a lovely one, that.
Yeah. And they stay out for a while. Then they come back and lie in bed most of the day.
It's really funny.
And then they might go out in the evening again.
Yes.
But they always come back, except... And if Ali is listening to this, Ali, please turn off.
Yeah, Ali, stop listening to this. Ali is our cat friend. And she's not impressed with the cats being outdoors at all.
Normally they come back. And last night, Top came back and Scaredy didn't. And unfortunately, we went to bed really early.
We were so tired.
We went to bed really early last night. And I have a camera. And of course, at 11:20, when I woke up this morning, I saw at 11:20, Top arrived back.
No, Scaredy cat
Scaredy
had arrived back
at 11:20
and was looking to get in.
So I looked out the door this morning at 6 a.m. or whatever time it was, and there was Scaredy just looking at me like kind of totally disappointed, with slightly frightened look.
Why did nobody open the door for me? What's wrong with you people? I've been sitting here all night trying to get in. But anyway, he is well in today, I'll tell you, and doesn't want to go anywhere.
Yes.
That's enough about the cats. Then you've seen a few photographs of the cats. We hope that you're doing well wherever you are in the 18th week of this lockdown, which seems to never end. We can't believe it's the middle of the summer and we haven't gone anywhere. We normally would be in Ireland at this time of the year meeting friends and family. So sorry about that we're not there. Really sorry, because we would have done the scoop actually, and the virus from there.
Yes.
But anyway, all a bit difficult. So, but stay well and stay healthy and don't get arrested. And yeah, I think that's basically that's everything for this
Don't
week.
forget to leave a rating.
Oh, and don't forget to leave a rating. We really appreciate them. And for those of you, the sustaining members who are giving us donations at the unreportedstorysociety.com,
we really appreciate it.
unreportedstorysociety.com, we do really appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.